I was probably just over a year into climbing, was really psyched at the gym, doing mostly auto belay and top rope, but climbing 3 or 4 times a week, sessions that were often like 3 or 4 hours long. On this one particular top rope project, I remember you were having to pull from under this roof using a small crimp on the upper face, and it was feeling bad, and I knew it felt bad, but I was pulling hard, and then I came down and I rested and I considered it. I remember considering it, and I was like, F it, and I went back and I pulled hard and I heard a ping, and it reverberated through my body, and my life flashed before my eyes, and it felt so tender and scary and like fragile, and like I knew right away like something serious happened. At the time, I really figured it was a product of just cranking too hard on that one move too many times, on like too bad of a hold or in too aggressive of a crimp position. But with 5 more years of climbing history under my belt, a lot more injuries, paying a lot more attention to my body and to how it feels and to how often I'm climbing and how hard I'm climbing and what sort of climbing I'm doing and what frequency and all of that, I don't really think that was the case anymore. I do think that the specific injury could have been avoided by not doing that specific move so many times in a row or with such poor technique or so stupidly, but I think I had my body in a state of injury susceptibility because I was climbing too much for how long I had been climbing and how much time my body had had to acclimate. I kind of get the sense that when I've gone through a period of a lot of climbing or a lot of volume with not enough rest, my whole body sort of gets in a state of possible injury, and it's more about just what goes first. Any single individual hard, weird, tweaky move could be the thing to set it off, but it really wasn't the culprit overall. Overall, it was overtraining or overclimbing over a period of weeks or months leading up to it that put my body in a position to be injured by that single move. Anyways, I was pretty freaked out, so I immediately set up a doctor's appointment and went in, just trying to get a little peace of mind. They did an x-ray, but not an MRI. X-rays are mostly for like bones and hard tissue stuff, and MRIs would be needed for soft tissue. Normally not covered under US health insurance unless you first do an x-ray and there's like a need for an MRI, and then you're probably still paying a lot out of pocket in most cases. But honestly, the doctor wasn't all that much help. So naturally, I took it upon myself to do a whole bunch of YouTube research. I quickly became pretty confident that it wasn't a full tear or a rupture, and therefore would be a very unlikely candidate for surgery. So I switched my focus mostly to injury rehab protocols. I got input from a bunch of sources like Hooper's Beta, Lattice Training, Eric Hurst, and a bunch of random docs and physios on YouTube. And luckily, I ended up following what I still think today was a pretty decent rehab plan. I'll preface this by saying I'm not qualified to give anyone advice about anything ever. Day 0 to 1, immediately following the injury, pretty much did no load on the finger. Focused only on range of motion stuff to make sure I wouldn't get like a scarred tissue buildup or some other thing that I don't understand that would inhibit the range of motion. Definitely don't want to lose that early on, so I didn't put any load on it in terms of taking load, tension on the pulley that I had injured in those first couple of days, but only made sure, I shouldn't say first couple of days, first 0 to 1 day. The day I injured it and the following day, all I did was range of motion, a little bit of manipulation with my other hand, maybe some light massage more for my peace of mind than anything else. And I also started contrast baths, which is where you have 2 things of water, one hot and one cold, and you have your hand in it for like a minute in each, going back and forth. And I think it's basically supposed to promote or exhilarate the blood flow that's going to the hand, and therefore kind of like bring stuff through more quickly, maybe help with more recovery or more like nutrient transfer, or maybe some more blood flow to areas that typically have a hard time getting much blood flow. So those contrast baths are a nice sort of like no risk way to feel like you're doing something early on in the process. I'm not really sure how effective it is overall. At about day 2, I started introducing some really light crimping. I got the palm of the hand recommendation from Hooper's Beta, and I found it to be really useful. I forget where I got this info now, but you really want to be shooting for a pain level of 3 or 4 out of 10 when you're rehabbing. And it is important to get a low-level load going through the injured tissue early on to start healing processes and to start signaling to give appropriate collagen alignment. If there's no signal telling the tissue kind of which way force is going to run through it, it doesn't really have a way to know, and so it lays it in a jumbled pattern instead of giving it a more appropriate assembly and pattern in the collagen that leads to a healthier and stronger tissue. In the first 2 weeks, I stuck to just applying load to the injured finger by hand, usually on the palm, in the orientation that it was hurt, up to a pain of 3 or 4 out of 10, holding for 10 seconds, resting for maybe 30 or 40 seconds, repeating that maybe 5 or 10 times, depending how it's feeling, always pulling to a pain level of 3 or 4 out of 10, and then holding it there for the 10 seconds. You can do that type of session 2 or even 3 times a day if you want, as long as it's spread out with 4 hours of rest or so in between, and you're not going too heavy on it, and it's not really painful still or staying really painful afterwards. You don't want it to be painful for a long time afterwards. You want it to be 3 or 4 out of 10 during, but then to recover pretty quickly afterwards back to the state that it was pre that rehab session. I really didn't want to stop climbing, and I thought it was important to take this concept of climbing around the injury rather than through it, one that I got from lattice training, I believe. But my finger was so tender and I was so scared initially that I would re-injure it or hurt it somehow that I decided to get a full finger splint and keep that on whenever I would climb. That way I really didn't have the option or opportunity to use it while climbing and accidentally injure it again, which I'm honestly really happy I did, because I believe even more strongly today in that concept of climbing or training around your injuries, but continuing to climb and train throughout. In weeks 3 and 4 following the injury, I added a little more structure to the light crimping. My favorite way to do that is farmer crimps, where you have a hold, hang weight to it, and you can then really track it easily over time by just increasing the weight by a half pound or a pound over periods of time going forward. So same thing, I would load up the weight to where I had about a 3 or a 4 out of 10 in pain. You may take some adjustments to find out what that weight is to start. For an individual finger, I actually found it was better in a little sling rather than on like a little climbing hold or a little hangboard hold or whatever. You can also do this by just pulling on the hangboard, but I found it to be really helpful to be able to track specifically the weight being used rather than just sort of like subjectively pulling harder or softer on the board, you know. I started with really light weight, like 2.5 pounds, and over weeks 3 and 4, I probably only got up to maybe like 5 pounds, kept it pretty light early on, still pretty nervous, and it was still pretty painful and tender. I kept the full finger splint anytime I'd go climbing, because I was still pretty nervous about injuring it. Weeks 5 and 6, I continued the structured crimping with the farmer crimps and continued to increase the load slowly. I think it's important not to try to rush it, but also just to keep a slow, steady pace that like every few days or a week, you at least try to add a little more weight as your standard. And if it hurts more than a 4 out of 10, or if you have a lot of lingering pain afterwards, it's okay to back it off or back down the number of sets you do, or start to back down the frequency of the sessions. In weeks 3 and 4, I started to go for a little higher weight and less frequency. So it was more like once a day, and maybe I'd do just a little light pulling to like feed it on another session another time that day. And eventually, as I got into weeks 5 and 6, I may even start doing alternating days. So the higher the weight that I could do on the individual finger, the more rest I took between sessions. In weeks 5 and 6, I also started to incorporate a little bit of light feet on the ground hangboarding. On the other daily and rehab stuff, it was all about the individual finger. This way, it was sort of starting to get it reincorporated back into how I'd use it in my normal climbing grips, but off the wall where I have control over the risk before I start to loosen up on the restrictions of the on-the-wall climbing for that finger. In weeks 5 and 6, I did start to take off the splint. Somewhere over those course of the weeks, I got rid of it and moved to buddy taping and or H taping. You might do one or the other depending on the situation. There's plenty of videos out there that I found to give good instruction on that. Taping is interesting because a lot of people say like, oh, well, it doesn't actually do anything because it's not as strong as your tissue, but it's not as strong as your healthy tissue. So if you're already damaged or at a disadvantage because you've climbed too much or whatever, the tape might help prevent or help recover from an injury by taking less load, but mostly it's like a mental thing to remind you that you're injured and not to just go gung-ho and pull hard and like accidentally injure it again, but to take that same slow, methodical, and stair-stepped approach of reintroducing it into the climbing as well. Throughout this time, weeks 5, 6, and probably even a little bit after, climbing should remain sub-maximal. I focused a lot on technique and aerobic endurance building and didn't worry about trying to get back to the limit I was at before or anywhere close to it. I was climbing down a finger practically, and then I was still babying it towards the end of those 2 weeks. Weeks 7 and 8, I looked to bump the structured crimping more towards maximal effort. So even okay if I didn't quite make it to 10 seconds before the pain level got past 3 or 4 out of 10 or before I failed on it or whatever, but looking for a little more maximal. So again, decrease the number of sessions to at least every other day. Might still do a little feet on the ground hangboarding in between to keep stuff working, getting ready to work as a unit and to keep some blood flow going to it during times when I'm not doing the rehab session. But I keep pushing towards more and more maximal effort on that injured finger so that I know what I can take off the wall where I have really good control of the risk before starting to let myself take more of those risks on the wall where it's harder to know whether I'm going to get injured or not. For weeks 9, 10, and kind of beyond, it just sort of depends how you're feeling. A lot of it's a mental game, so if you're still feeling like it's really painful and really weak and really sore, like the tissues are probably mostly healed by this point, or they've probably had the time they need to get mostly healed, and it may be just retraining your brain to say, it's okay to pull, I don't have to send a pain signal every time, it's not so injured anymore, or it's not injured anymore, or it's not susceptible to being re-injured so easily anymore. But if you've been babying it for a long time, which is kind of appropriate, you may have some mental hesitancy to allow your body to pull on it without either getting pain or without backing off because you're afraid. You almost feel like it's weaker than it is as well because you're scared to use it like you probably could. So training through that is a lot of weeks, 9, 10, 11, 12. It could take a couple months, in total. I think it took me about 3 months in total to be back to like climbing normally and not thinking about it all the time. I kept taping for quite a long time there. I kept slowly easing back into it and continued my focus on mostly sub-maximal climbing. And then after about those 3 months or so, I was really able to more or less forget about it and move on with my climbing like I'd been doing before. Just simply avoiding a position or a hold type that hurts is not a long-term solution. You really need to take that approach where you mimic whatever hurt it, but do it slow and in a controlled environment where you can slowly progress the load that it can take over time. And that's really what does the best job of telling your body how to realign fibers and get stronger and back to performance, levels over time. Ultimately, I feel like I actually made some progress still during that time in my aerobic and technique and sort of just like mental approach to lead climbing, or at that time more top rope and auto belay climbing, but my breathing, my body positioning, my sort of like decision making, all of that I felt like was able to still improve during this time. So it really wasn't time lost. And luckily I was able to build some good habits for future rehab. I got like the funniest comment I've ever received on one of my recent videos. A guy said some nice stuff about the video, but said it was kind of like a shampoo commercial because I was like stroking my hair during it or whatever. And I thought that was so funny. I climb a lot, especially outside, and I get injured a lot, not so much lately. So I make a lot of videos kind of like this. I do some other stuff too though, snowboard and other things. So if you're considering subbing, make sure to keep that in mind. But thanks for watching.